Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to CR Conversations. Today we're going to start a special series on the IMF program. As you know, the mission is coming or about to come or is here to review the program. The program review is about to happen. And I thought it would be a good idea. In fact, all of us thought it would be a very good idea if we got together, the leading intellectuals in Pakistan, whoever, I'll try and find as many as I can. And we got different views on what they feel that the program should now include. We've had 25 programs without any success. Basically, it seems that throughout our history, we've been in an IMF program because each IMF program lasts roughly about 1 to 3 years. Payback period is roughly 5 to 10 years. So if you can think about it, we've never been in out of an IMF program for the last 77 years. It's time we thought about graduating. But the question is, many of us feel, and we'll discuss that right now and again, many of us feel that perhaps we are not hitting the right themes, perhaps we are not doing the right things. No sort of offense to anyone and no trying to say that, hey, we know best, but I think we have views and we should think about it. What are the things that we should include in this program? We know the reform agenda is huge. We know Pakistan needs to reform for the next 50 years. So of course, we can't go for everything today, but there must be some few things that we can do in this program. So we're thinking of the short term, we're not thinking of the long term. Very short term, what are the things that we can do? For example, what would we suggest that the IMF include in this review? I mean, simple things like what can be done in this review that will help the situation. So for that, I'm very grateful to my old friend Shahid Kardar, former governor of the central bank, former minister of finance in Punjab, a well-known academic, vice chancellor of Beacon House University. Shahid has kindly agreed to lead the session. So Shahid, I'll turn to you with this question. Do you think that there are things that can be added on to the program or the program design revised? What are your suggestions for the IMF? And we hope that the IMF will listen to it seriously and try and understand. These are our views. We are not imposing on the IMF. Who are we to impose on the IMF? But I think our views and comments are really important. So Shahid, over to you.
I think, to begin with, I think the issue is really more the design. We fully understand that this is a legacy of not just 40, 45 years. These are issues which have really been, we have been lumbered with for a variety of reasons. Let's not go into them. We should be talking about how to address them. And the IMF programs typically, because they are 3-year programs, it's difficult to obviously achieve the objectives that we all want to achieve, including the fund and us in particular. It will require a much longer period. But for the moment, we need to be talking about what could be done in the short term. And the short term is 3 years. Admittedly, 3 years may not be a long time, but certainly a lot of things can be done in 3 years with the kind of clarity that I think we hope that we can introduce through a number of both policy actions and instruments and so on. Just to emphasize something that you and I have had repeated discussions privately as well as 1 or 2 of your podcasts. Everything seems to revolve around just doing an exercise, the arithmetic exercise, just making sure that the numbers somehow match. I mean, I understand how the fund looks at the financing part, and I'm not ridiculing it at all. All I'm saying is, what are the features that seem to be missing and should be addressed in the short term? For the simple reason that they are looking at a cash-based system where a lot of liabilities are building up outside the cash-based system as we speak. So some of the areas which both of us in particular and some other colleagues with whom we've interacted, our view is that this emphasis on the tax to GDP ratio without looking at the other side of the fiscal equation, which is the expenditure side, we will continue to run into a problem. I know the standard argument which is made is that, look, at the end of the day, our expenditures are not that big a problem because at the end of the day, we will still have to have some expenditure. But you and I would say, let's get our act together in terms of the priorities. So we need to fix the expenditure side first. You and I both know we will never be able to achieve it simultaneously. To think some people would argue, oh, we need to raise taxes and in the meantime address the other side of the equation, which is the expenditure side. You and I both know once the revenue is raised and the state machinery will continue to learn how to spend it. And just to illustrate that point much more graphically, the federal government, after the 18th Amendment, and now has 43 divisions, 400 attached departments with 650,000 employees. What you and I would call the autonomous organizations are 520,000 employees. And if you look at the 520,000 employees in the autonomous organizations, we have the great achievement of having their accumulated losses are now 5,700 billion, 5.7 trillion. Just this year, the losses exceeded 1 trillion. Just 2024 losses have been that. And these are after subsidies of 790 billion, 370 billion of grants and equity. Why am I mentioning these numbers? Is that, to give you an example, the fund, and everyone seems to think that the solution is privatization. You and I both know. Out of the 126 organizations, the so-called autonomous organizations, 78 of them are commercial organizations. The vast majority have to be closed down. And I can read them out. You have Pasco, you have Telephone Industries, you have the State Engineering Corporation, you have the National Fertilizer Marketing Limited, your favorite organization called the Trade Development Authority of Pakistan, the Industrial and National Productivity Organization, you know, the Technical Assistance Center, the National Institute of Electronics, the Cotton Trading Corporation. There are 5 commercial organizations in FATA. You have the Edible Oil Corporation, the Fertilizer Research Institute, PPAC, Plastic, and I can go on. I'm just mentioning the power holding company.
Just to add to your list, Shahid, I was passing by the stadium the other day and I saw a new organization which I didn't know before. It's called the National Tunneling Institute.
There you are. And by the way, we are adding authorities and organizations by the hour. So unless we fix that part, and I genuinely believe we need to fix them first before we start addressing the issue of taxation. No one is saying taxes don't need to be, is an area that don't need to be addressed, but that's the first area in which the other important part of all these organizations, and your favorite, is the public sector development program. So we now have we have more than 1,160 projects, and you know, on a daily basis, projects are being added. So this is a number based on almost a year-old number. So 1,160 projects will take more than 15 years to complete.
And the throw forward
today, and the reason sorry, go ahead.
Throw forward is 9 trillion.
9 trillion. Okay. Thank you for reminding me. But the more important part in this is, which is linked to the front program, everyone is happy that the budget deficit is well under control. You and I both know. All we have done is squeezed the public sector development program, which means, which you and I both know, means essentially that liabilities are building up. Because a contract has been awarded to me, and my meter is running. So there will be time and cost overruns, which are liabilities building up, and who knows who will pay them. And the time and cost overruns, you and I both know, will be huge. Most of these projects were designed on a completion period of 3 to 5 years max. And we already know they will take at least 15 years to complete. So all the numbers the fund looks at are meaningless. That's what I really want to emphasize. So that's part one. The second is, here we have the discussion on privatization, and we are being told that some of them can't be privatized, so all the losses have to be picked up by the taxpayer. Okay, so the losses that cannot be picked up by the private sector will be picked up by the taxpayer. And I ask a very simple question: why the taxpayer? Why were the banks lending to these agencies? They have actually lent out 2,800 billion to loss-making enterprises. So I want to know if the banks were continuing to lend to agencies which were, and they were doing it purely on what? So-called sovereign guarantee. Now we know how good the sovereign guarantee is, and the banks could see it. We were not servicing any of the liabilities to the IPPs, including the Chinese, and we've been rolling over our external debt. So what were the banks thinking? Why shouldn't the banks now take a hit? So everyone is saying they need to be protected. They shouldn't be taking a hit. Otherwise, the financial sector will be in deep turmoil. But they brought it onto themselves. And all they're saying is that all these losses that these agencies are making should be passed on to us. Moving on, the fund doesn't look at the mere fact that today all the bulk of the private sector is heavily protected. I know they keep writing about it now. Heavily protected, both tariff and non-tariff barriers. No serious attempt has been made and can be done. We know we can't remove all these barriers of the regulatory duties, the additional customs duties, and so on overnight, but we need to do them, and the process must start now to make sure that they become effective and competitive. You and I both know what has happened is a lot of agents, institutions, and private sector are now being set up, saying, oh, we will assemble phones. Give me a break here. Are they serious? So we will now actually assemble phones in Pakistan, which will be competitive when it comes to we are far better off allow these phones to be imported. For the technology is out there, and there is no way that we can compete with them. And in fact, we will end up paying far more on the, if you look at the actually net cost to the economy and society in general. So this part needs to be addressed. Moving on to the other area, which is the regulatory framework. In the past, we needed to go to the ministries, 43 of them, 43 divisions. And now, of course, we have the honor of having more than 48 ministers. 43 divisions we used to go to them for permission as a private sector. Now, we don't have to just go to the ministry, but we also have to go to a regulatory authority. So now there are two layers. The divisions, you and I both know, now have, when we look at the number of employees, 85% of them are those who are clerical, peon staff and no skills, with literally no skills in a world. And why am I emphasizing it and mentioning these numbers? Because the world has changed. This is a digital world, and the skills that are there in the grades 1 to 16, which make up 85% of the payroll, they don't have the skills to be able to compete. If you look at the civil service, the so-called 17 grades to grade 22, I mean, we have a civil service structure. This is essentially of the employees, for the employees, by the employees. And these guys, this guy has read English, can be Secretary Health in the morning, Secretary Education in the afternoon, Secretary Finance in the evening. So that's the kind of skill set in a world which has changed dramatically. Technology and other areas in which we really don't have the labor force to be able to compete. So why am I emphasizing that? I'm saying, look, we need the skill set to change, and the best way forward is now to say, look, and that to me is something that we should be presenting as the government, as the kind of reform measures that we keep mentioning. The reform is, look, to the fund, it'll take us a little longer, but we are heading in that direction. We pruning the size of government and improving the skill set for us to be prepared for the world which is changing thanks to technology, artificial intelligence, and so on.
So what condition can the fund put in this review that will start the process that you are asking for?
It's basically saying we need to reduce the size of government, and reduction in the size of government essentially will mean that a lot of these organizations can be closed down. You protect the pension entitlements they've received to date. I would say those who work more than 35 years, please retire them straight away. Protect their pension entitlements. And the reason I'm emphasizing that we will have to do it in that fashion is to present how we're going to change the way. The government has started a right-sizing program, they claim. And the reality you and I both know is, give you a simple example. They said, they informed us that the Pakistan Works Department has been closed. It has reappeared as Pakistan Works Authority. So we haven't really, there is no change that way. So unless we can show to the fund that we are addressing the fiscal issues and addressing them in a fashion that will not create liabilities in the future, because as we are adding more organizations, it's not just a one-time exercise. There will be the operational costs, which will continue for time to come, and the fund doesn't look at it. The fund is looking at the expenditure today.
Can the fund put in a condition? For example, it is all too easy to create an organization. Now we passed this bill, I've forgotten the name, it's something digitization or something bill. It has created 3 new agencies, right? And the question is, how can we stop this? For example, when an agency is created, I think you'll agree with me that the agency is created, but we are never shown a set of accounts or a business plan. How's it going to go? Now, you know very well, and we've all seen it, that when a business plan is presented by a startup, they do give you an idea of what the expenses are, where are the costs going to go, etc. And they keep it in an evolving process, and they keep the investor or the board on board. Now the question is, what can we do to make this difficult so the government can't create agencies?
Now, I think to begin with, 2 things need to be done. One is let's start with the PSTP. And then I'll come to the organizations in a second. For the PSTP, it should be clear. The fund saying no additional projects to be approved. Second, actually revisit all projects where only 25% of the expenditure has been made. You and I both know what the expenditure on 25% is. It's people who've been employed. I retired as a civil servant. I was loyal to some political authority. I've been hired as a project director. And
they buy cars immediately.
Now, I was just going to say, buy cars, telephones, peons, and drivers. So that's the only expenditure. I think we need to take the decision very clearly that this is sunk investment, sunk expenditure, and we need to write it off. And only complete projects on an ongoing basis, at least on which more than 60% of the expenditure has been made. So that's the reform part that you asked. Coming to the organizations part, it should be very clear. No new organizations without being able to show how you will maintain yourself within the budgetary constraints, not just today, but over the 3-year program that we have with you, which means a set of accounts. And the reason I mentioned, and I'm glad you raised it, have you ever seen the set of accounts of the discos that we think we will be able to privatize? I challenge you to show me them. The set of accounts of discos we think that we'll privatize. And the reason I emphasize again, is that if you look at the case of discos, who we think we will privatize, the reality is those are functionally not viable, some of them. We think these are profitable entries. If you look at the balance sheet of these organizations, they are profitable only because we continue to show them as having a lot of receivables from where another public sector organization, all of whom are bankrupt. So until unless, and that should be the condition of the fund, saying no new organization, if an organization show us how their budgets, the operational side will be reflected over the next 3 years, and please show us the financial statements of all these organizations, particularly the ones that we are referring to going forward. The third area should be that it should include areas like defense. And I'm not talking about the nuclear program. I'm saying we should be showing to them that we are serious people. We are looking at the numbers of our defense personnel, and of course, non-combat expenditure. So that's the other area that we need to, frankly, focus on to be able to show to the fund that we are moving in that direction. And one of the areas which will be important for the new agency, not allowing new agencies, is really focusing on the regulatory aspect. Because there are too many regulatory agencies, we're not allowing people to carry out commercial activity. We are a huge constraint, apart from what you and I would refer to as the constraints in terms of the tax structure. There are these other, no one can seem to start an organization, even something as basic as a restaurant, without 6 or 7 agencies' approval. We do not want people to carry out businesses and then are surprised. And finally, and just staying with your question, finally, it should be very clear that the fund should say, look, gentlemen, when it comes to policy actions and instruments, why don't you present a program to us on what we generally refer to as policy predictability? I should know what the sunset clause is. Policy predictability should be spelled out very clearly over the 3-year program period, which frankly the fund has never addressed. Even today, all kinds of talks are being made about what we should be doing on net metering, what should happen to solar power, what should happen to existing liabilities, and what the tax structure will look like going forward. And that you and I know, and everyone, particularly in business, knows better than I. And you, if you're asking people to take a long-term decision, how can they take a long-term decision when the government itself can't take a decision even in the short term? So the signal should come from government in taking, like a much longer term view, and that should be at least over the fund program period, a 3-year program, clearly stating the policy actions that will be taken over the 3-year period.
I 100% agree. I think that's an excellent point. But let me bring you back to the budgeting side, because you made some very valid arguments on the expenditure side. Tell me, how is it that every few days we hear a new announcement from the government on a new project that was not in the budget, or a new program? For example, these cards that are coming out, Kisan card, this card, etc., that was not in the budget. So how are they announcing them all the time? Why don't they announce them in the budget? A. B, for example, Lahore Metro has just announced $2.5 billion worth of a new metro in Lahore, despite our debt issues. Now, I don't know how this happens. You know the budget very well. Should the budget not include these things? Are there enough, how should I say, for lack of a better word, slush funds in the budget, or repriority arrangements, or whatever, that allows them to do different things? Or alternatively, for example, even the media campaigns that they run. It seems to be a huge amount of money that they have to run media campaigns. Huge amount of money, there's foreign trips that they take. So do we have a budget that we are in control of or aware of or not?
No, I think you make a very important point, and both of us have had experience of this. Even before the ink of the budget papers has dried up, supplementary budgets, supplementary expenditures start. I mean, that's the reality. In the budget, there is no such concept of a budgetary constraint. I mean, so in a sense, we are back to this, the earlier question and my response. We need very great clarity in what is included in the budget and what is permissible. Our own experience has always been that people come in and just come up with a number or so there is a liability now, sir, we have to discharge this obligation. So the obvious answer is, where will the money come from? Has it been built into the puppet, or have you set aside a slush fund, as you would say, to service this? So I mean, the transparency of the budget numbers and not just the accuracy, but the integrity of the budgetary numbers is not clear at all. And as you rightly mentioned, if you look at the provinces is now becoming a major issue. I'm going to give you just two very quick examples. I was the finance minister in the Punjab in 1999-2000 for 6 months. And I remember there were 22 departments in the Punjab government. And I argued at that time that there were 7 too many. Now we have 42. And you and I were yesterday in a particular get-together where someone was arguing very passionately that they had actually divided an existing department into 4. Okay? And the Punjab today has 43. You look at KP. I'm just giving you another example. KP, 1/3 the population of Punjab, has 39 departments and 1 government servant for every 68 provincial population, members of the provincial population. So, and who knows what those numbers are? And everyone keeps talking about wanting more revenue under the NFC award. No one is looking at the expenditure side at all. And the only way that the fund looks at it is looking at what you and I would refer to as the surplus to be provided by the provinces. Cash surpluses. But the reality is those cash surpluses are shown. All we know is that the liabilities are building up on their side as well. And you gave a very good example today of just now of the 2.5 billion that is being planned. $2.5 billion is being planned. Dollars is being planned for an underground. And how will it be financed? Very simple. Taking another loan. The multilaterals are quite happy. And I keep asking myself, here we are, you have the fund, you have the World Bank and the ADB just giving out money and complaining that these are, Pakistan doesn't reform itself, structural reforms, I mean, the ones that we talk about, structural reforms are never taken, but they continue to lend to this child whose behavior does not seem to change. So why shouldn't it also take a hit? I mean, they've been lending to us knowingly that here is this child whose behavior hasn't changed at all. At no time. The other day, you and I were hearing that part of the problem is that we have a power structure in which most of the politicians really are not to be blamed because we've always had a hybrid regime. You and I'm going to ask you a simple question. Nawaz Sharif had a 2/3 majority in his second tenure. Were there any reforms taken? I challenge you to show me one. So it's very easy to run down the army. I'm not defending them. I'm saying the mere fact that we can't run PIA, the mere fact that we can't get the education system working, We can't seem to run steel mills. We can't seem to run PIA. Now, am I supposed to blame the army for this? Or is that a governance issue from our side on which we need to show that we are serious people? Sorry, I'll stop.
Wouldn't the fund say that these are beyond our purview? Now, if we come back to the program, right now what I hear from you, which is very important, A, the program must ensure policy stability, predictability, more important, sorry, predictability, so that the program actions must be clearly delineated and the government should not allow arbitrary movement back and forth. Second, there should be controls on agencies' growth or growth of government. There should be controls on that. There should be a process. Thirdly, there should be transparency in the budgeting process and as well as budgets of organizations and despite the law, we do not have audits of SOEs and regulatory agencies, and they don't make them public. So there should be public, transparent audits, etc., available. And for example, we don't have information on the number of employees. We don't have information on assets like buildings, housing, cars, etc., etc. So we should have those. Third thing that I hear from you, which is also very important, is which is a tough one, which I don't know how the fund can do, which is expenditure control. I mean, I think, how does the fund go about making the budgetary process more transparent? Prevent discretionary expenditures during the year. This thing that I'm going to give out, start a campaign for this, or give out this package or that package. I mean, without any prior work, without any prior research, without any, and later on the package happens and we never get a report on what the package is. For example, okay, we've opened langars, we've distributed food to the poor, but we never hear any accounts of what happened, how many poor were serviced, how many food dishes were given, etc., etc. The second thing is that it shouldn't happen ordinarily. There should be a process by which these things should happen. So that's another thing. Now we come to debt management. As you mentioned before.
Just one moment, just to embellish what you said. It also applies to the PSTP. Yeah. Has any impact assessment been done? Has anyone been ever held accountable for unsatisfactory impact of the expenditures that we have made? So I think greater, not just transparency, but I think far greater detail needs to be provided in the budget on what is going to be spent and really spelled out very clearly. I think that clarity needs to be there, very much a part of the process.
And then now later, another thing that you mentioned, which is also very important, and now tell me how to codify it in a program, since you know programs very well. This ability, this not ability, but this expanding debt of the public. No, I shouldn't use the term debt. I should use the term liability, because partly the liability is known. Partly for example, commodity finance is not known. The thing that you mentioned earlier, that you have these contingent liabilities growing all the time, banks lending to the public sector corporations, etc. How do we codify that in terms of a fund document?
I think one of the things, part of the problem is we have a cash-based system. But I think the only solution now, it appears to me, is that apart from what we said about the PSTP, is basically insisting that at the start of each year, each agency tells us what their liabilities are, which either will have to be discharged this year or the next year. And the reason I emphasize, so we're back to the 3-year program framework. The reason I emphasize this is, then at least we can hold someone accountable for the fact that you mentioned that this was your liability and its payment has not been reflected in the budget for next year or for this year. So I think a greater effort now needs to be made on the bills which are lying somewhere in the system, unpaid, and someone needs to tell us why these have not been discharged. If there is a dispute, at least it should be very clear what the numbers are, which are disputed or not disputed. I think that's important. Some work seems to have been done on the so-called circular debt of the power sector as well as the gas sector, but everything else there is no data. And I think now the time has come for everyone to be required to actually present this as part of the budgetary process as to what bills are still lying outstanding and have not been discharged and for what reason. No effort. At the moment, there is no one, and I challenge any ministry, any department to be able to tell me what their liabilities are which have not been discharged. And one of the reasons of having for doing that, or of actually squeezing the size of government is, you know, I know, and they know that if you don't squeeze the size of government, each one of them will actually make sure there are one or two schemes in the PSTP. So you are merely increasing the size of the public sector development program, both at the federal level and of course the ADPs of the provinces, simply because there is a department. And everyone will create an opportunity for a slush fund to be able to get a car under the project, which will actually meet my needs of my family, or finance my telephone bill. So if we can focus on these areas where we can insist that the liabilities ought to be known, squeezing the size of government will also make sure there are fewer projects to be supported and financed.
But in terms of...
And get a better feel for the priorities of government. Sorry.
But for the IMF to now codify, I'm thinking of program sort of performance clauses or whatever, criteria, whatever you can think of. What should the IMF write down in all these areas? And we'll come to the tax then quickly. What should the IMF write down? These are very important points. But let's make it very clear for the IMF, because IMF will then say, look, you guys are very vague, etc. Clear, concrete performance clauses that the IMF can write down in this review.
I mean, should I repeat the ones that we've already mentioned?
No, you just make them very particular. I'm saying don't repeat the whole thing. Just give me the clear performance clauses so that the IMF can know.
First, no new projects. Okay. Second, a very clear review very quickly of projects on which we've spent less than 25% and what the government plans to do it and what will be spent over the next 3 years and should be part of a medium-term budgetary framework. Third, no new agency to be created until unless we can look at the operational side and the reflection in the medium-term budgetary framework of the 3-year period to be able to see that very clearly. 4, policies to be followed on tax and other areas over the next 3 years, very clearly spelled out, and what the phasing would be. 5, what are we going to do in terms of the SOEs, very clearly setting out which are to be closed, the exercise to be completed over the next 1.5 years, which to be continued, which to be closed, and what the impact will be on the budget of each one of them over the course of the program. Very clear. Insisting on each of these agencies' accounts to be presented every year. All of them, without exception, their accounts should be presented. And wherever there are the losses side of the expenditures to be met by somewhere from the budget to be reflected in that. More details on in terms of the budgetary expenditures that will be made and any projects that will be identified, what the operational expenditures will be over the next 3-year period in terms of any agency which has been created or other programs, other projects over the next 3 years. So I think the medium-term budgetary framework with all these numbers put in, very important. I'll come to the tariff part much later. What we are going to do with essentially clearly showing how government is going to reduce and prune the size of the federal government because that's where the focus will be for the moment, in terms of the payroll and other expenditures, clearly setting out that if you've talked about right sizing, what should we expect in terms of both the size and how it will impact the budget. I think those details on the budget are very important. One other area that I was thinking of very quickly while you were speaking, I think I've discussed that, the policy predictability part. Have I missed anything? I mean,
where the problem is going to occur in what you're saying. The
well,
government
just
will.
one other thing. I think,
So,
so just one thing. I mean, you asked a very pertinent question. What is the mandate of the fund that we should be focusing on? And here is a fund which is now looking at the constitution and the judicial system. So I mean, I'm totally myself confused as to what the mandate of the fund is. So on the one hand, you very rightly asked, what should we focus on? What should be the performance indicator? Here we are, the fund has gone beyond its own mandate, and now in the garb of governance reforms is dealing with the judicial system, way beyond its. So everyone is looking for an extended mandate at the moment.
but Shahid, I'll tell you, I agree with all that you said. All these 5 or 6 points are very important. But the lacuna, I'll tell you, is where. The lacuna is that they'll say, we'll review the PSDB projects. They'll say, we'll review expenditures. They'll say, we'll review this. But then they'll set up those commissions that you know very well. Commission the 5 ministers, 3 secretaries, their usual thing. And the commission will meet once in a while. And, nothing will ever happen. Now, and it'll extend to 1 year, and then 2 years, and then 3 years, then
but
4
then
years.
Why should the fund then give waivers? I mean, that's the key. I mean, if we can't have those kinds of details done, why is the fund giving waivers? The fund will give a waiver.
Good point. So the fund should set these conditions with clear timeline. That's part of your predictability exercise. That if you don't have clear timelines, there's no predictability. So your predictability.
And if something is not measurable, it will never get done.
Yeah. Now, but the other thing I would say is that perhaps the fund should also, and the government should also think of what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, it's not always that the committees are made of governments. Committees can be outside the governments too. We can have clear professional committees, and they don't have to be part-time committees. You can have full-time committees doing this. Remember the Turner report? Remember there's so many reports that I can think of that were done on a very, even in our past, in the British days, or even in the early Ayub days, there were a number of commissions, full-time, and they did a very good job, put out proposals, Ahmadur Rahman Commission, case in point, lots of things. So we can do something like that too. Nowadays, we stopped doing that. We only think that the committee can only be part-time and made up of ministers and bureaucrats. So maybe...
And deliver in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and deliver in 2 weeks, and then we forget about it. It doesn't deliver in years. For example, the right sizing committee. Right sizing committee is headed by the Deputy Prime Minister, but it's been 4 months, and it's going to be another 10 months before, or even.
No, but it all is government servants who are stakeholders in this.
Exactly. So now let's come to 2 important things before we close. Tax and tariff. Okay. You were on this tax commission, you can talk about that. The second thing is tariffs. I think tariffs are extremely important. You'd agree with me or not?
I mentioned earlier that the tariffs, really, if you want a more competitive framework, you need to look at the tariff structure. And I'll be the first one to concede that it can't be done overnight, but it can be done over 3 to 4 year period. And it should be clear as to what we're going to. I mean, to begin with, you and I would argue next year, all the regulatory duties and the additional customs duties should disappear, should be eliminated as a starting point. And then the year after, we will start adjusting the rest of the tariff. Second, in the second year, we will also look at the non-tariff barriers and remove 50% of them or completely all of them. So these are, measurable areas that we can actually build into it. So in a sense, the tariff structure over the next 3 to 4 years make it the kind of tariff structure we see over the rest of the world, even in our own region. So if we look at that tariff structure and we say we're going to get there, but we start off by getting rid of all the regulatory duties and all the additional customs duties in the next budget, end of story, and we move on. And we all know there'll be what the implications will be in terms of possible the exchange rate and so on. Second, these import restrictions and all need to be phased out very, very quickly. I mean, look, and these import restrictions are on the face of it, these are not even non-tariff barriers because we don't know anything about them. The third area on which we have really not spoken before we come to the tax part is really the exchange rate. I think the exchange rate part, and we need to address the current account and making sure the current account.
I want to stay on tariffs for a minute. Let's look at tariffs for a second.
Okay.
What you said is absolutely correct, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. But there is a bigger problem. 50% of revenues come from tariffs.
I was going to come to that.
What do we do about that?
Look, I mean, just reminding our own selves about the work that we did as part of that group that we got together on revenue. And we showed that there is no loss of revenue. In fact, we're better off over a 3-year period. So we showed that. And we showed not just the adjustment by taking care on the import side of the regulatory and the additional customs duty, we also looked at how to lower the rates of the tariff. So in a sense, we showed that to be the case. When it comes to the rest of the tax revenue, we showed how simplification and lowering of rates will increase the number of transactions, will increase the number of avenues that will open up if you will allow commercial activity to take place. And that we were linking with the regulatory framework. Please allow people to carry out transactions. And you know better than I that at the end of the day, GDP is the sum of all transactions that take place. And if you don't allow people to transact, which is what we seem to do, there will be all these kinds of issues of revenue not being raised. I mean, take the case of the so-called informal structure. You have an industrial relations ordinance. It says anyone with more than 20 employees will have to make sure that he has a tax structure in which he can handle 68 withholding taxes, which will be paid at different stages of a transaction. Come on. And that small agency is now, once it has 20 employees, has to pay for EOBI, Social Security, you name it, allow trade unions. And then we are surprised that there are 70, almost 80% of the labor force actually ends up in these organizations. So it's the regulatory framework which if it is eased, will allow transactions to take place and for revenue to be generated. And that was much of the discussion that we had.
Another problem here, what you said is absolutely correct. Music to my ears, I agree with you. But there's I think a bigger issue that we try and all skirt. Issue is that when you make these changes, tariffs, regulations that you're saying, there will be, I'll be a little harsh, there will be some death in industry. Right? And I think we are very averse to allowing bankruptcy. We are very averse to allowing any changes in the industry. How do we deal with that?
I think you make a very important point. I should have mentioned that there will be losers and gainers. But politically, it may not be that difficult. I mean, at a much broader level, although, of course, these people are well connected and may be able to get that kind of support that we are referring to. Because there'll be fewer in number, it will be easier to handle politically. The trouble has been, and you understand this, and the fund understands it very well. You see, we never what did we do? We didn't allow a current account to operate where we allowed a, a more competitive environment. Because we provided protection, say, to someone manufacturing a telephone. In the process, we created other institutions and organizations which were suppliers. So in the process, we've added on far more agencies which have a stake in a system of protection. So whereas we were trying to protect one agency, we actually created protection for a number of small agencies and organizations in the private sector, which were at different stages of efficiency, different levels of efficiency. That has created the kind of problem that will make it much more difficult for us to handle. So what do? I think we will probably have to do it in a phased manner where we think we can address some of them more easily. Typical example at the moment is some of those which can never be profitable in the long term. Take the case of cars, take the case of this. We did open up something on the motorcycles part of the, although of course the other issue in terms of the fuel efficiency and pollution aspects. But there are certain sectors on which we can take a decision without really having a political backlash that we will not be able to handle. To me, cars is one of them as an example. To me, the other example is perhaps the sugar industry. Allow them to compete. The third area where I think we won't run into a problem is cement is another example where you open up, you won't have that problem. To me, it's opening up overall. With phasing and focusing on these areas first by lowering tariffs and so on. And protection.
But Shahid, now there's another elephant in the room, I think, which I deliberately left it to the last and which is very important to discuss. When we touch tariffs, when we open out the economy, when we fix our tax system, etc., all these things, there'll be two consequences. One we'll leave out because there'll be a slight recessionary impact for a year or two, but fine. But which we are already facing, so it doesn't matter, we'll get a little deeper. But the bigger impact is exchange rate. And I think I don't know if you agree with me or not, I'll ask you a question. I think we are the most confused about exchange rate. Throughout our history, we've never understood the exchange rate. And we also seem to think that the exchange rate is a matter of this, it defines the strength of our economy. So yesterday I heard somebody was asking a question, some famous anchor was asking a question yesterday. Look, the Indian rupee used to be more expensive than Pakistani rupee 50 years ago. Today, it is 4 times cheaper than the Pakistani rupee. Now, you and I may laugh at it, but this is how people are thinking. So what about the exchange rate? Well,
it's not just people thinking, it's also the case of the level of the leadership.
Yeah.
We somehow think it's a sign of our, masculinity and virility. Yeah. I mean, look, and the other confusion on the exchange rate is, your old institution, the fund itself, has been responsible for the appreciation of the exchange rate over time. Everyone starts looking at the real effective exchange rate. You and I both know that really doesn't reflect the reality, because for the simple reason that assumes that you will have a much more open economy. And everyone is looking at the RER. It's well under control. Why? It's only under control because it looks nice for the simple reason you're not allowing the economy to function. So if we were to have a free-flowing, more open economy, the exchange rate won't be what it is, but it will eventually reach an equilibrium. It will do, it must do. It will help our exports, reduce our imports, not through restrictions, but simply because it will reflect the competitiveness of the the economy. And of course, at the end of the day,
I have a supplementary question. I think it's a very important question. I'm self-confused about it. Everybody thinks that the nominal anchor in the country is the exchange rate. Now, this is a complex question, and I don't know whether we can even fully discuss it here or not. If the exchange rate is not the nominal anchor, then what is? And if the exchange rate is the nominal anchor, then we are kind of stuck. So how do you deal with that question?
no,
And
I
you
think
can
that's an important question.
explain what a nominal anchor is. You can also explain that.
Okay, people just actually do, there is a fact to it, that there is, that we tend to look at the exchange rate in terms of what impact it will have on inflation and hence on my costs and so on and so forth. So to a large extent, it is a factor, I confess. Now, there are two ways to address this, the basic part of your question. Do we do it by putting the entire economy through a cold shower and do it in one go? And let things adjust? Frankly, it may not be that simple. So that's the answer to your question. So maybe, for instance, if we were to do it immediately, I suspect it will easily shoot over 300 immediately. Okay. Now, and once it does, it is an important factor in inflationary expectations. That's a fact of life. It is an important factor in inflationary expectations. So, and of course, businesses do look at the input side. I mean, take the case of just the textile sector as an example. 60 to 65% of their input costs are dollar-based. So these things are important. Now, do we do it in a slightly phased fashion? Easier said than done, because that may not give the kind of signals we are looking for, because I may turn around and say, oh, they'll be adjusting the exchange rate of 1 rupee every 2 months, so it'll actually reach there. So playing a waiting game. Should we put it through the cold shower and just do it once? It will have an inflation impact. Some of them will, of course, become competitive. Others will die down if it's a combination of the exchange rate and the tariff. So the tariff and the exchange rate is the kind of, I think, trade-off we need to look at very carefully. And finally, linked to that, it is important that we, when I refer to inflation because of the exchange rate, I think we need a serious effort to carry out research on what's the acceptable trade-off in terms of inflation and growth. Frankly, I think we need to look at that. And then it's a much more comprehensive exercise to look at the growth rate, the inflation, the exchange rate, impact on inflation in the short and the medium term, and how we can change inflationary expectations with somehow over a period of time, the nominal anchor changing over a period of time. Not easy. Finally, the more difficult part will be overall our culture. Frankly, it's much more difficult. You can have all kinds of policy actions, instruments, and institutional structures, but it's the culture part which is far more difficult to handle, both politically and otherwise. I mean, the thing that you mentioned, the anchors will say this, they will be crying hoarse. The politicians were equally confused and perhaps more confused because their understanding is very different. They genuinely believe that the exchange rate is somehow a sign of virility and masculinity of our economy.
No, this is a great conversation, Shahid. I wish we could continue it, but quite frankly, we're running out of time. So I want to close with one very important question. I think we've laid a lot of details for the fund, and I hope they do. But the exchange rate question still perplexes me. You're right about, phasing it out or slowly, tariffs, etc. My feeling is whenever we give too much discretion, the other side takes all the discretion and runs away with it, right? So I'd like to bring in one more issue, which is very important. The structure of the fund program, I mean, the whole point of the fund program, the way I understood it, and I'm sure you would agree, the whole point of the fund program was build up reserves. And I must confess, 25 programs later, our reserves are still where they are. I mean, there's like still 1 month basically, and also of imports, 1 month of imports at best. And even then, net reserves are even less. So reserves, to my mind, are net reserves. Reserves are not. When I take a loan and I have some bank balance, my bank balance doesn't mean much. It's a net balance that means something, right? What I have left over. So I'm thinking, why is it that we always fail to build reserves? And what is it that we can do? All this that you said is fine. How can we quickly build up reserves? And
I think
reserves,
one of the things one way of addressing the exchange rate would also be for a target of the state bank to be actually building up reserves, say by 1.5 to $2 billion a year over a period of time. Today, the fund is quite happy that they're building reserves. Forget the net reserves part for a moment. Quite happy, the building up reserves, saying, had they not done so, the exchange rate would have actually appreciated, without mentioning the part that the only reason why the exchange rate would have appreciated is because of all these restrictions. So I think the build-up reserves and the exchange rate could be linked. We could have a very clear policy which says the state bank deciding, the central bank deciding that they will build up reserves by really buying, $2 billion worth of, add $2 billion worth of reserves every year. And that hopefully will also address the issue of the exchange rate without any restrictions. I mean, just buying straight from the market to build their, we're not borrowing to buy these reserves and so on. So to me, perhaps one of the ways to address the exchange rate and make it slightly more competitive in a more, how should I put it, a more methodical and a more policy-driven way is by actually building up reserves or buying from the market and building it up.
So I think let me sort of combine two of your thoughts there. One is the predictability part, two is the building up reserves part, and two is fixing a target like 1.5 or 2 billion. And this can be calculated. It should be hardened. I'm not saying this number is hard. We have to harden it somehow. But also, rather than State Bank doing it randomly, State Bank can announce on a daily basis, we're going to buy X number of dollars, $200 million, $300 million. We're going to buy from the market, finished. And it's going to happen every day, regardless of that. So it should be factored into the account.
You're saying the same way, interesting point, you're saying the same way, the way they actually announce an auction of the T-bills and the PIBs.
Simple. I think that would be the best. The year, certain reserves. And as you build up reserves, there'll be confidence in the system, there'll be confidence in the exchange rate, and we'll get eventually to where we want to get, right? We want confidence in the exchange rate. We want a market-determined exchange rate, but a market-determined exchange rate that is based on adequate reserves being seen by people. Because as we know from Krugman's famous paper, if you don't show adequate reserves, then people will speculate. So once you've got...
No, point taken. But let me pose a question to you. I hear you very clearly. Interesting point. We understand that reserves give people that comfort. That goes without saying. But the only thing I'm asking myself the question, if I announce it, can this policy decision be gamed by the market? Provided, of course, we make sure we are not just buying from the banks. We should be able to buy from anywhere we want to. Because one of the problems of what we have as the primary dealers on the T-bills and the PIBs, we've actually restricted the market to a large extent by saying you're a primary dealer and you're not a primary dealer. So as long as we get out of that, I take the point very entirely, and I agree with. I find it fascinating. If we can do it in such a way that it's not restricted to a certain set of agencies and institutions that can sell to us. So there's no primary seller of the exchange rate from which the central bank should buy, then no one can game the system.
Good point. Shahid, I'd love to run on, but unfortunately, I think we've run past the patience of our audience. You and I can probably continue, but our audience probably will lose interest. So inshallah, I'll call you again one day. But this is a very important discussion. I hope the fund listens, and I hope we can get more clarity and more granularity in our program based on stuff that we know in this country, and not necessarily, and we're not anti the fund, we're not anti the government, we're not anti anything, we're just talking technically. So that's a very important thing to bear in mind.
We're basically saying we're all trying to achieve the same objective. I mean,
Absolutely.
everyone's trying to achieve. And there are different routes to achieving the same objective. That's it.
And that's the whole point of economics or social science. There are always different routes, and it's a matter of choices. And how do you make choices? You have to make them on technical points. You can't make them on nothing. You have to make them on technical points. And again, what we've discussed here needs to be fine-tuned when it comes into performance contracts.
Of course.
So thank you, Shahid. Thank you very much. Inshallah, we'll continue this discussion. Thank you. All the best.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.